Something is changing in Latin America right now. I've seen it. I've been on the road talking to people, and there's an optimism that I haven't heard in maybe 10 years. You don't find it in every country. You hear it more in Brazil and Mexico than you do in, say, Argentina or Peru. But I am hearing a cautious optimism that after a really lousy 10 years, when Latin America's economies essentially didn't grow at all, that we may now be entering a new, relatively bullish era of stronger economic growth and some really unique opportunities in areas like renewable energy and e-commerce and nearshoring, where Latin America has a clear competitive advantage. Now, I know what you're thinking. Brian, how can you talk about optimism at a time when migration out of Latin America is at record levels, climate change, rising crime, poverty is still high after the pandemic, the politics is still not great in the majority of countries, and yeah, that's all true. But if you look at this chart, this is foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean over the last 10 years. And last year, we saw FDI rebound to the highest level on record. That's $224 billion. During a year when FDI flows globally were actually shrinking. And this tells you that people are making bets on the region right now. If we look at economies as a whole, GDP on average is expected to grow 2.3% this year and next, according to the IMF. And look, it's not great, but it is a cut above the average growth that we saw in the years prior to the pandemic. So something's up. And we've boiled all this down to 5 reasons why it's okay to feel a little bit bullish about Latin America right now. This is the subject of our new issue of America's Quarterly, which you can find on our website, americasquarterly.org. So the first reason for optimism is Latin America is far. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, the region is far away from these big conflict points that we're seeing in the world right now. Ukraine, now Israel and Gaza, and potentially in the future, Taiwan. And in a world that is becoming more dangerous, Latin America is maintaining a certain distance, not just geographic, but also by trying to keep a certain neutral or non-aligned posture, especially when it comes to that conflict between Washington and Beijing. Some question whether that posture is sustainable over time, but at least for now, it has made the region something of a safe haven for all nations to invest. And just this year, we've seen delegations from United Arab Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, China, and of course the United States, which is the source of about 40% of FDI into Latin America. Most of this interest has been around agribusiness. These are companies looking for resources, looking for food to nourish a global middle class that is expected to double over the coming decades. And if you look at this chart, it shows a kind of basket of commodities prices. And okay, they're up compared to the last few years. But as Ilan Goldfein, the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, recently told me, this cycle, it's not a price boom like the 2000s was. It looks like more of an investment-led boom, money pouring into ports like the Chinese are building outside Lima and other infrastructure. And that means that growth may not be as dramatic as it was during the 2000s, growing 4 or 5% a year, but it may prove more sustainable over time, which is good news. The second of our 5 reasons for optimism, Latin America is near. This one's maybe a little more obvious. Many countries, including Mexico, but not just Mexico, are taking advantage of their proximity to the United States. And this big shift that we're seeing right now in global supply chains, nearshoring, this idea that companies in the wake of the pandemic, as well as increasing tensions with China, are bringing production out of Asia and closer to home. We knew this was coming. We've talked about it at America's Quarterly a lot over the years, but it seems to be happening faster than many people expected. FDI in Mexico is up 40% this year. Some really big projects. We saw Tesla announcing in northern Mexico a new $5 billion gigafactory for producing electric vehicles. I'm not exactly sure what a gigafactory is, but it sounds cool. And, like everything else, it's not as easy as it sounds. These areas where nearshoring is happening face big challenges with inconsistent electricity, water, and infrastructure. Mexico's business sector doesn't have a great relationship with the López Obrador government. But overall, things are moving in the right direction. Mexico in July passed China to become the U.S.'s biggest trading partner again for the first time in 20 years. The IDB says nearshoring could add $78 billion a year to the region's exports. And already we see trade rising in the region as a whole. And it's a trend most think will continue to build in coming years, especially as some of these geopolitical tensions get worse. Our third reason for optimism is a little more nuanced. It's a potential energy powerhouse. And look, the word potential here is important. This is a case where you have to cut through the hype a little bit. Let's take the example of lithium. Latin America accounts for about 60% of the world's known lithium resources, most of it in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, but production has actually been fairly stagnant, as governments have passed legislation requiring the state to take a major role in exploitation. Latin America only attracted about $20 billion in renewable energy investment last year. That was 4% of the world's total in that sector, when Latin America accounts for 8% of the global economy. But look, nobody doubts the potential here. The needs of the energy transition are just too great. And talking with investors, everybody has the clear sense that these barriers eventually will be overcome. Renewables already account for about a quarter of Latin America's primary energy. That's double the global average. Brazil's wind power industry has doubled in size since 2018. Some say that could soon make it the world's fourth biggest producer of wind power, behind just China, the United States, and Germany. Uruguay in June announced $4 billion in renewable energy projects, half of which had to do with green hydrogen. Now that's an area where several other countries, including Chile, have huge potential. So more to come on all of this. The fourth reason for optimism is the politics aren't as bad as you think. So let's be real here. If you look around the region right now, you don't find many politicians on left or on right who are focused on economic growth. You have democracies under pressure, gridlock on reforms. It's really tough out there. But, I feel like we've become so accustomed, maybe even addicted to talking about politics, that it's easy to lose sight of the moments when officials actually deliver. Take the case of Argentina. Yes, even Argentina, where in July they opened up a new gas pipeline worth $2.7 billion that connects the Vaca Muerta oil and gas field, which is massive, to the central part of the country. And in one fell swoop, that will save Argentina $4 billion a year in gas bills that it was previously importing from other countries. And that happened despite all the inflation, all the other dysfunction that we see in that country right now. And, no, it's not as good as it could be. Further extensions of that pipeline will be necessary before Argentina can export gas to Brazil, much less to places like Europe. But it's still a really big deal. The other thing to remember is that, for better and for worse, almost no politician in Latin America gets too powerful these days. There are exceptions, of course, including the region's 3 dictators. But check out this chart, which shows the presidential elections in Latin America over the last 5 years. The countries on top, those are where opposition candidates won those elections. On the bottom, that's where the party in charge won. And you can see it's just Paraguay over the last 5 years. Put another way, of the last 20 free and fair presidential elections in Latin America, an opposition party has won in 18 of them. Is that kind of a measure of dysfunction? Yeah. But the upside is that no single person is too powerful. And when a government tries to stay in power by interfering in elections, or persecuting their opponents, or illegally grabbing power for themselves, as happened in Brazil, Guatemala, and Peru in the past year, democratic institutions have held their ground. And for anybody who has a working knowledge of Latin America's history, that's something to celebrate. So here is the fifth and final reason. The digital story really is fantastic. All of us all over the world are addicted to these things, but studies have shown that Latin America has some of the world's most intense users of smartphones and social media and other tech platforms. This has been true for years, but it accelerated during the pandemic. And so there are tremendous opportunities right now in e-commerce, where sales are booming, led by companies like Mercado Libre. But it's really more than that. Some of these tech companies are really democratizing things, giving millions of working class Americans access to credit and digital payments for the first time. I'm talking about platforms like Pix in Brazil or Codi in Mexico, as well as fintechs, where the market leader Nubank now has more than 85 million customers across Latin America. Nubank's founder, David Velez, told me he thinks artificial intelligence is going to genuinely revolutionize access to healthcare and education, two areas where the region could really use help. Latin America has been a region that has punched above its weight in the tech space for the last 10 to 15 years, maybe longer, a large number of unicorns, and there's every reason to think that will continue or get even better in years to come. So look, here's the bottom line for me. It's always easier to feel negative about Latin America. It really is. And look, there are so many challenges. But at the same time, the external context right now for the region is so favorable. Latin America has what the world needs right now, whether it's renewable energy sources, food, workers close to the US market, and more. And some good things are happening at home as well. If the politics were better, maybe economies would be growing 4 or even 5% a year. But as is, if it grows only 2.5%, that will still feel like progress. So again, I think it's okay to feel a little bit bullish about the current situation and about the years to come. Thanks so much for joining us, and you can read more at americasquarterly.org.